Some mornings arrive with a silence too heavy to be peaceful, the kind that settles into the wallpaper, seeps through floorboards, and waits with you at the kitchen table. I've lived long enough to recognize that kind of silence. It came more often after George passed. 8 years is a long time to talk to a man who's no longer there, yet I still speak to him as though he's in the next room, trimming the hedge or fixing the porch light he kept promising to fix. Promises don't die, they just fall asleep when no one's left to wake them up. My name is Marjorie Klein. I turned 78 this spring, and the house on Maplewood Avenue has been my home for over 5 decades. It still remembers everything, the grooves in the banister from Thelma's stubborn fingers when she was learning to climb it, the small crack near the hallway door where Wesley once flung a basketball inside, claiming it slipped, the kitchen windowsill, scarred but warm, where I used to line up their vitamins each morning. These were not just walls. They held breath, arguments, joy, grief, birthdays, and Tuesday dinners that lasted too long because no one wanted to do the dishes. Time softened the noise, but not the weight of what was lived here. Now it's just me. And Reed, occasionally, when he visits. My grandson doesn't come with an excuse or an empty plate. He comes because he wants to. He drinks the tea I brew too strong, listens to the same stories I've told before, and walks me to the porch like I might fall between the floorboards. He makes the house feel alive again, even if only for an hour. Wesley still stops by, but only when a form needs signing or when tight on funds this month means I become a convenient ATM with fading eyesight. Thelma visits less, and when she does, her wristwatch ticks louder than her voice. I don't ask for more. I stopped asking the day I realized they showed up only when something was broken. Cars, pipes, marriages, and left the mending to me. The blueberry pie was almost ready that morning. Reed always smiles when he smells it. His way of saying thank you without needing words. I'd learned to read silences better than sentences. When he arrived, I looked at the tall, slightly awkward young man at my door and wondered when the boy who used to trip over the welcome mat became this quiet presence. He sat in the same kitchen chair George once favored, and for a moment I saw both of them, past and present, seated at the same table, asking me about the weather or the world. That day, though, the air felt different. There was something unsaid in the way Reed poked at his pie, the way his fork paused mid-air before asking what I planned to wear on Friday. Friday. I blinked. He hesitated. It's Dad and Mom's anniversary dinner. Didn't he tell you? My smile didn't fade. It only moved, just a little, from my mouth to somewhere behind my ribs. No, I said. No one told me anything about Friday, but I suppose they meant to. If this story already speaks to you in its quiet beginnings, I hope you'll stay with me until the end. Subscribe to the channel, follow each part as it unfolds, and share your own stories of silence, family, and the dignity of walking away, right here in the comments. After Reed left, I stood by the window for a long time. The blueberry scent still lingered in the air, but the kitchen felt colder somehow. Across the street, Beatrice Fletcher, same age as me, was laughing in her garden with her grandkids. Her daughter brought them every Wednesday like clockwork. I used to think routine was dull, but now I see it differently. There's something sacred about being expected. It means someone noticed if you didn't show up. I hadn't been expected on Friday. I waited for a call, a message, anything from Wesley. I told myself he probably meant to call, that it slipped his mind, that he'd bring it up soon, casually, the way he always did with things he didn't want to talk about. I waited through lunch, through the evening, flipping through photo albums I no longer opened much. Wesley grinning with a missing tooth. Thelma on her first tricycle. George holding Reed up to reach the apples. Pictures don't lie, but they don't tell the whole story either. They freeze joy in a frame and leave the shadows just outside. It wasn't until dusk that the phone rang. I recognized his number immediately. I answered with more warmth than I felt. "Hello, darling." He didn't match it. His voice sounded stiff, like he was bracing for something. He spoke quickly, too quickly. "Mom, I wanted to let you know about Friday. We have to cancel. Cora's sick. Fever, flu. Doctor said rest for a week." I listened. Said all the right things. "Poor thing. I hope she gets better. Do you need me to bring anything?" He cut me off too fast. "No, we've got it covered. Just wanted to let you know." Then he hung up before I could say anything else. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but its echo stayed for hours. Something didn't sit right. Not the cancellation, not even the fact that I hadn't been invited directly. It was the way he said it, the way he rushed, the way he sounded. Relieved. As if he wasn't just informing me, but locking a door gently behind him. I tried to convince myself I was reading too much into it, but when I called Thelma later that evening and asked about Cora, she sounded confused. "Sick?" "No, Mom. I haven't heard anything. I've got to finish an order for the shop." Her voice was sharp, distracted. She didn't ask questions, just hung up. That night I didn't sleep, not because of the ache in my joints or the restlessness that comes with age, but because something had shifted. It was the quiet kind of hurt, the one that doesn't announce itself, but lingers like cold in your bones. I kept telling myself there was an explanation, a surprise maybe, a mix-up, but my instincts told a different story. And the worst part wasn't the lie itself. It was how smoothly they told it, as if I wasn't meant to notice. Thursday morning arrived in a kind of hush, the sort of quiet that doesn't soothe. I made tea, but forgot to drink it. It cooled on the table while I moved about the house, pretending to tidy things that didn't need tidying. The sun outside was warm, but it didn't touch the rooms inside the way it used to. I walked from window to window, watching the street instead of my own thoughts. I couldn't let it go. Not the phone call, not Thelma's distracted answers, not the strange hesitation in Reed's voice the day before. My children had always been complicated. That wasn't new. What was new was the realization that they could decide something together, deliberately, and keep it from me. Around midday, I walked to the corner store. I didn't need anything, but the aisles gave me space to think without mirrors. In the produce section, I ran into Doris Simmons, an old acquaintance who'd worked with Thelma for years at the flower shop. We made polite conversation, the way people of a certain age do, and then she said it. "I heard Thelma's taking tomorrow evening off for the celebration. 30 years is quite the milestone." I nodded slowly, managing a thin smile. "It is." When I got home, I sat in my usual chair and didn't move for a long time. There was no longer room for doubt. The dinner wasn't canceled. Cora wasn't sick. They were all going, and I wasn't meant to know. The neatness of the lie disturbed me more than the exclusion itself. That they had crafted it together, each one covering for the other, meant this wasn't a careless oversight. It was a quiet decision made somewhere behind closed doors, probably over coffee and mutual nods. And I was the topic, the problem to solve. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because there's a kind of pain that goes beyond tears, a sort of sharpness that doesn't spill over but pulls inward. I went to the cabinet in the back room where I kept old documents and letters. Among them were George's will, the deed to the house, insurance papers, things Wesley had brought up often, always wrapped in concern. "For your safety, Mom," he'd say, "you should put the house in our name, just in case." Thelma had said it too, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. A home that size is too much for you now. We can help manage it. I'd always refused. Not out of stubbornness, but because I knew. Even when I hadn't let myself name it, I knew there was something in the way they circled the subject. Not fear for me, but plans that didn't include me. That afternoon, the phone rang again. I expected silence when I picked it up, but it was Reed. Grandma, did I leave my blue notebook at your place? I told him I'd check the living room. While I searched, he kept talking. If you find it, can you give it to Dad tomorrow? He said he'd be by before dinner. I stopped moving. Dinner? I asked, careful. There was a pause. Yeah, the one at Willow Creek. He's picking you up, right? I sat down, the phone still in my hand. No, honey. He told me it was canceled. Said Cora was sick. Silence. Longer than it should have been. He called me an hour ago, Reed said finally, voice tight. He said we'd meet there by 7. And that was the moment when everything quiet inside me went still, not because I needed more proof, but because the last thread had snapped. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd erased me. That night, I didn't turn on the lights. The house sat around me like a waiting room with no appointments left. I moved from chair to chair without purpose, the way people do in unfamiliar places. Except this wasn't unfamiliar. It was my home. But suddenly, it felt as though it belonged to someone else, or rather, to some other time when I was still at the center of it. I couldn't stop thinking of how easily they had planned it. A family gathering, anniversary, toasts, champagne, and no place set for me. Wesley had called to lie, Thelma had lied by omission, and Cora had agreed to it all. That much was clear now. They hadn't stumbled into a mistake. They had decided it together. Later that evening, the phone rang again. I picked up, half expecting silence. But it was Cora, her voice bright, pleasant, too pleasant. Edith, just wanted to say, Wesley told you dinner's canceled. Such a shame this virus knocked me off my feet. I listened. Let her speak. Let her lie. Then I said, I hoped she felt better. She responded with something about medication and bed rest, then hung up quickly. A performance, from beginning to end, one she hadn't rehearsed well enough. I sat by the window, darkness pressing in from outside. The street lamp flickered the way it always did near midnight. A moth fluttered against the glass. Inside, everything was still, but in that stillness, something shifted. Not in anger, not even in sadness. What came over me was clarity. I walked to the hallway closet, the one I rarely opened. Inside, behind a stack of winter blankets, hung a dress I hadn't touched in years. Dark blue, simple, the one I'd worn to George's funeral. I pulled it out, shook the dust from the sleeves, and held it up. It still fit, a little loose, maybe, but the seams were strong. I laid it gently across the bed. Then I pulled out the pearl necklace George had given me for our 30th. I'd worn it only twice since, once on the day he was buried, once on our last anniversary before the hospital became our second home. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, catching the smallest trace of gold from the drawer's edge. I wasn't sure yet what I would do, but I knew I wouldn't stay home, waiting like a forgotten package on someone's doorstep. Not this time. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want shouting or accusation, but I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I wanted to know that what I suspected was true, not to be cruel, but because truth, once faced, stops gnawing from the inside. I stood in front of the mirror, the dress draped over my arm. My reflection looked back without expression. Older, yes. Thinner, quieter, but not small, not erased, not what they had decided I was. I laid the dress across the armchair and turned off the light. Tomorrow would come, and this time I'd be ready. I left the house an hour earlier than needed. The dress fit better than I expected, as though it remembered the way I carried myself when George was still alive. I fastened the pearl necklace carefully, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I didn't want to forget myself, even if they already had. The drive to Willow Creek wasn't long. I knew the roads well. George and I used to go that way on Sundays, just to watch the river turn gold in the afternoon light. That night, the streets felt different, brighter somehow, but not in a warm way, more like a stage, lit and waiting for actors who no longer knew their lines. I didn't park in front. I chose a space behind the building, near the delivery entrance. It wasn't secrecy I wanted, just space to breathe. I walked quietly around the back, past the kitchen doors, and toward the side of the restaurant. There, through the tall windows, I saw it all. They were seated at a long table near the center, white linen, flickering candles, silver polished enough to reflect guilt if any of them still carried it. Cora was laughing, a full laugh, the kind you don't give when you're recovering from illness. Thelma was showing someone photos on her phone, her hands moving freely, no trace of obligation. And Wesley, my son, the boy I once sang lullabies to in this very dress, he was raising a glass, his shoulders relaxed, his mouth mid-toast. There was no empty chair, no sign of me ever being expected, no glances toward the door, no checking of watches, no pause that might have whispered, "Maybe she'll come." I stood in the shadows for longer than I should have, watching them move through the evening like I was already gone. Maybe in some way I was. They had practiced this absence long enough that it had settled into habit. And now it played out like any other family scene, except this one had edited me out. There was no anger in me, only confirmation. It's strange how heavy clarity can feel, like standing in the snow too long, not because it hurts, but because you realize how numb you've already become. Behind me, the wind picked up, lifting a corner of my coat. I adjusted it carefully, as though that small act might steady the rest of me. Then I turned and walked back the way I came. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to be seated or served or noticed. I had seen enough. They had lied not just to protect themselves, but to make space for a version of life where I no longer complicated the picture. That night, I went home without speaking a word. But silence doesn't mean nothing happened. The next morning, the blue dress hung across the back of my chair like it had something left to say. I folded it neatly and placed it back in the closet, next to the cardigan I wore most days. I wasn't sure what I felt. It wasn't betrayal, not in the fiery sense. It was something slower, quieter, like a page being turned too soon in a story you weren't finished reading. I hadn't planned on seeing any of them that day. I thought I might sit with my tea, maybe tend to the garden, or reorganize the drawers George had left untouched. But by noon the doorbell rang. It was Reed. He didn't smile, didn't wait for me to ask why he came. He stepped inside with a weight behind his eyes that felt far older than his years. "Grandma," he said, "I didn't know. About last night. Until I saw you through the window." So he had seen me. I nodded, offering him the chair across from mine. He didn't sit. He paced. "Dad told everyone you were too tired to come, that you didn't want to make a fuss. He even said you sent your love." His hands tightened into fists at his sides. "I don't understand why they did it. You didn't do anything." I didn't answer that, because what could I say? That sometimes people don't need a reason to pull away. They just need enough time and a little convenience. Instead, I asked, "What time did they leave?" "Almost midnight," he said. "They toasted without you, cut the cake without you, took pictures, smiled." I looked down at my hands. The pearl bracelet still circled my wrist. I hadn't remembered putting it on. Then Reed said something I didn't expect. "I want to take you to Thelma's. Today." I looked up. "Why?" "Because they think you'll stay quiet," he said. that you'll disappear the way they wanted you to. I didn't move for a while. Then I rose, walked to the mirror by the hallway, and adjusted my hair. Not to look impressive, not to strike back, but to stand upright in a house that thought I had bowed. When we arrived, Thelma's house was full of leftover balloons and the fading smell of celebration. She opened the door without checking who it was. When she saw me, her smile faltered, just slightly, like a chord struck out of tune. "Mom," she said, "I didn't know you were coming." I didn't answer that. I walked in, past the table where empty plates and wine glasses still waited to be cleared. Wesley sat on the couch, phone in hand. When he saw me, he stood too quickly, as if caught doing something wrong. They waited for me to speak, for me to ask why, or to cry, or to leave. I didn't do any of that. I walked over to the framed photo on their mantel, George holding Reed as a baby, and took it down gently. "Thank you," I said, "for confirming everything I needed to know." And then I turned and left. Sometimes the return isn't about re-entering the room. It's about choosing which door to walk back out through and making sure they all see you do it. After I left Thelma's house, I didn't cry. Not on the porch, not in the car, not when I stepped back into my quiet kitchen. What I felt wasn't sadness anymore. It was a kind of release, the kind you get when you finally stop pretending something still works, like when an old lamp flickers one last time and you decide to stop fixing it. I made myself tea, sat at the table, watched the steam rise and vanish into the morning light. Then I went to the cabinet where George kept all our legal papers, tucked in a locked drawer behind our wedding certificate, and Reed's old school drawings. I opened the folder marked Estate Final Copy. I read every word again, even though I'd read it countless times before. George had always been careful, practical, fair. He'd set it all out clearly. The house, the investments, the land upstate, no one remembered we owned. Everything in both our names, everything protected. But there was one clause Wesley and Thelma had never asked about, never thought to, because they assumed they'd already knew how the story would end. The clause was simple. In the event that I passed before distributing the estate, everything would fall to Reed. Not shared among them, not split, not contested, just Reed. George had added it the year Wesley tried to push me into transferring the house's title for tax reasons. He hadn't told anyone, not even me, until one cold evening near the end when we sat in the den with soft jazz playing, and he said, "They won't see him coming, but he'll know what to do when the time's right." I hadn't understood then. I did now. I called the lawyer the next day, a soft-spoken man who had handled George's affairs with quiet loyalty. I told him I wanted to make one small adjustment. Nothing dramatic, just an affirmation. That Reed's guardianship of the trust would begin early, with my consent. Not after my death. Not after they circled back to clean the table they'd pushed me away from. He didn't ask questions, only said, "I'll prepare the papers." 2 days later, I met Reed at the notary's office. He read every line slowly, carefully, with a furrowed brow and the kind of quiet that told me he understood more than he let on. When he signed, his hands didn't shake. "You're sure?" he asked. I nodded. "You've always seen me. That's all I need." We didn't talk about Wesley or Thelma, not because we were avoiding them, but because they no longer needed to be at the center of the conversation. That evening, I returned home and placed the signed documents back in the drawer, this time at the top. Sometimes you don't need to confront people with words. You confront them by removing the assumption that they still matter to your future. I mailed the envelopes on a Thursday morning. No return address, no handwritten note, nothing to trace emotion, just plain white envelopes, each containing a single photocopy. I didn't include the full will, just the page with George's signature, the trust clause, and the new appointment. Reed Klein, sole executor and trustee, effective immediately. Thelma's arrived first, judging by the silence. She didn't call, didn't send a message asking what it meant, but I knew she'd opened it. I knew by the way she stopped posting cheerful family pictures online. I knew, because Doris from the flower shop stopped me outside the grocer's and said, "Thelma's been a bit off this week. You all right, Marjorie?" I smiled. Never steadier. Wesley's envelope took 2 more days. He knocked on my door that Sunday, not out of guilt, not even out of surprise, just calculation. He wanted to know how much I knew, whether it was just about the dinner or something deeper. I offered him tea, but he declined. "I don't understand what this is about," he said, holding the paper like it was something dirty. "It's about clarity," I said, "and memory." George remembered. Wesley's face shifted, just slightly. "It's not fair to divide things that way." I didn't respond, because it wasn't division, it was consolidation. One name, one heir. One person who had shown up not for assets or advantages, but to help carry groceries when my hands trembled in winter. To call, just to ask if I'd eaten. To listen, not because I had news, but because I had silence. Wesley stayed standing in the hallway, arms crossed like a boy, refusing to admit he'd been caught. "So what now? We're just cut off?" I looked at him, not cruelly, not with triumph, just clearly. "You were never written out, Wesley. You just never read what was there." He left without finishing his sentence. I watched from the window as he walked down the driveway, slower than he arrived, envelope still folded in his hand. That evening, Reed called. "They know now, don't they?" I said yes. He didn't ask what came next. Neither did I, because the thing about confronting people without rage, without spectacle, without shouts, is that it leaves them alone with their own reflection. And sometimes that's far louder than anything I could say. The house was quiet again, but this time it was the kind of quiet I chose. There's a certain quiet that follows after a house stops expecting company. It's not the silence of loneliness, nor the relief of solitude. It's something in between, a stillness that has accepted its own shape. That was what settled over my home in the weeks after the envelopes. I continued with my days. Tea at 7, a book by 9. The garden needed weeding, so I gave my knees the work. In the afternoon, I listened to the birds and let the sun press gently against my shoulders. It was a quiet routine, but I noticed something. It no longer bent around the idea of them. I wasn't listening for footsteps on the porch. I wasn't hoping for a call, an apology, a change of heart. That version of hope had dissolved quietly, like sugar in warm water. I hadn't heard from Wesley since the day he stood in my hallway holding the document like an insult. Thelma had vanished too. No polite check-ins, no concerned messages, not even the kind of surface-level gestures people make out of habit more than care. But their silence wasn't punishment. It was avoidance. They weren't waiting for reconciliation. They were waiting to see if I'd undo what I had done. I didn't. Instead, I called Reed one morning and asked if he had time to come by, not because I needed help with the garden or company for tea. I wanted to show him something. We sat in the den, the old room that still smelled faintly of George's cologne. I handed him a small brown envelope, the kind we used to keep film negatives in. Inside were photographs, old ones, birthdays, fishing trips, a Thanksgiving table from long ago. All of them had one thing in common. Someone had always taken them. Someone had set the table, lit the candles, held the camera. That someone had been me. Reed looked at them slowly. "You kept all of these." "I did," I said, "not because they were perfect moments, but because they were real. He nodded. Then he asked very softly, "Do you think they know what they've done?" I thought about that, about how people can edit their own memories until they no longer resemble the truth. "I think they know something is missing," I said. "They just haven't admitted it has a name." Later that week, I heard from Doris at the market that Thelma had lost her biggest contract. Bride changed florists last minute. A mistake in delivery, apparently. Then someone from Wesley's office mentioned layoffs, restructuring, a possible closure of one of his smaller projects. These weren't dramatic crashes. There was no scandal, no headline, but I recognized the sound of it, the slow erosion of a structure built on presumption. Because the truth is, when you build your future on the assumption that someone will always wait quietly for you, you stop checking whether they're still in the room, and eventually you turn around and they're not. I didn't need to confront them again. I just needed to keep living as if they weren't coming back, because they weren't. It was a Sunday when I received the email. The subject line simply read, "Do you remember this?" No name, no greeting, just a scanned image attached, a photo taken 30 years ago in the backyard, under the oak tree that George had planted the summer we moved in. In the image, I was holding a cake. Wesley stood beside me, maybe 12. Thelma, still in pigtails, had frosting on her nose. George had taken the picture from the steps just before lighting the candles. We all looked sunlit, caught mid-laughter. I remembered the moment because I had planned it down to the ribbon on the table. They had scanned it from a copy, one they didn't know I had framed and tucked behind the bookshelf. The email came from Wesley's office address. No message followed, but I understood what it was. Not nostalgia, not regret, just a quiet attempt to reach backward, to touch something they had thrown away before realizing it still held weight. I didn't respond. Instead, I went to the box in the hallway cabinet where I kept older prints, the real ones, thick paper, bent corners, faint scent of ink. I picked out 5 that told the truth they no longer included in their version of family. Reed's first steps, Thelma's college graduation, where I held the camera through tears, Wesley's second wedding, where I sat alone at the end of the row. Each one reminded me that memory doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to those who stayed present while no one was looking. I mailed copies of those 5 photographs to Reed. A week later, he placed them in a local exhibit at the community center, part of a project titled Mothers of the River Valley. He listed me as the photographer and included my name in the corner. Nothing grand, nothing performative, just truth, quietly returned to its place. That was when Thelma called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that sounded rehearsed, something about misunderstandings, about family always finding its way back, and how maybe we could talk. I listened to her voice, not to the words, but to the gaps between them, and for the first time, I heard hesitation, not control. Later that week, Reed stopped by with a newspaper clipping. The exhibit had been featured in the Sunday section, my name printed small but clear. He said a woman had visited the gallery and stared at my photos for a long time, then left without saying a word. She looked like Thelma, he said. I nodded. It probably was. We didn't say more. We didn't need to, because sometimes the only way people learn what they lost is when they see others honoring it in public. They had tried to reclaim a moment, one photograph, one scene, because they thought it could be separated from the person who made it real. But you cannot edit the one who held the camera. You can only admit you never looked into the lens. Spring came earlier than expected. The crocuses pushed through the soil like they knew I had almost given up on color. I hadn't planted anything new, not really, but somehow the beds began to fill. Hyacinths from years ago, a stubborn row of daffodils, even the rosebush George once thought wouldn't make it through another season. They returned, Not because I asked, but because something quiet and persistent still lived beneath the surface. I spent more time outside, not waiting for anyone to join me, just tending, listening. The bees came back first, then the butterflies. I didn't speak to them, but they stayed anyway. That was enough. One morning, Reed brought me a new set of gloves. "Figured you might need these," he said, holding them out with that same half-smile his grandfather used to wear. They were soft, a pale green. I tried them on and said, "These will do just fine." He stayed to help me weed the path, but mostly we worked in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't ache, the kind that builds something. When we finished, we sat on the back steps, watching the sunlight hit the maple tree just right. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd see you live alone like this. Not alone like lonely, but whole." I looked at him. I didn't think I would either. It wasn't bitterness that had kept me quiet all those weeks. It was clarity, the kind that arrives when you stop trying to rewrite a story and just close the book. Wesley hadn't reached out again. Thelma sent one more message, a picture from an old trip, no words, just an image. I didn't reply, because what they missed wasn't my approval. It was my presence, and that isn't something you get back with a photograph. The garden grew without them. The house stood. I baked again. Nothing elaborate, just small things. Loaves, tea cakes, pies from whatever fruit I had on hand. I gave them to neighbors, to Reed's friends, to the librarian who always remembered my name. None of them knew what had happened. They only knew that I had hands that still created, that still offered, even after they'd been pushed aside. And that, I realized, was the difference. Some people need an audience to feel generous. Some people need absence to feel powerful. But I had learned how to live where neither was required. The garden never asked who stayed. It only bloomed for the one who kept showing up. The last time I passed by Thelma's street, the porch light was flickering, not broken, just weak, like something trying to stay on longer than it should. I didn't stop. There was no reason to. Nothing of mine remained there. Not a scarf forgotten behind a chair, not a dish tucked into the wrong cabinet. Everything that was once tethered to me had either been erased or discarded, and I let it stay that way. I never went back to that house, not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even for closure. Closure, I learned, isn't something you receive from someone else. It's what happens when you walk past the last chapter without waiting for applause. There were things still in storage, old books I'd lent them, a painting George had framed, a quilt I sewed for Reed when he was small. I knew they wouldn't throw those away. But I also knew they would never look at them the same again, not after what they lost, not after what they revealed. Reed kept visiting. We built new rituals. Wednesday, tea at 4. A shared journal we passed back and forth, leaving entries in the margins. He brought over groceries sometimes, but only the things I liked. No suggestions, no substitutions. And once, just before summer, he asked if I wanted to take a trip with him. Nothing grand, he said. Just a little space, somewhere quiet. I said yes. We went north, to a lakeside cabin George and I had once talked about buying, but never did. It was smaller than I imagined and colder at night, but peaceful in the way that only unspoken things can be. I sat on the dock one morning, watching the mist lift off the water, and I thought, this is what it means to live beyond the edge of the story they wrote for you. No one called me back. No one asked for forgiveness. That was the true ending, not a collapse, not a reunion, but the absence of further demand. I still wore the necklace George gave me, not out of sentimentality, but out of recognition. Some promises hold even when others fall away. And now, when people ask about my family, I tell them the truth. I have a grandson, I have a garden, and I have a life that no longer requires anyone's permission. The rest, they'll have to explain to themselves, because I never went back for the rest. I didn't need to. The greatest revenge is walking away without looking back. Share your own stories of walking away in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and stay with us through the next heart-deep story. Thank you so much for watching and supporting our channel.